Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special Climate Project event. Thank you all for coming. My name's Richard Lester. I'm a professor of nuclear science and engineering, until recently the international vice provost, and now serving temporarily as vice president for climate. And it's my great pleasure to introduce President Kornbluth. I think Sally is going to outline the purpose and goals of today's session, but I do just want to say that the reason we're all here is because of her leadership and vision for MIT. We're also here because the MIT community, our faculty, our staff, our students, has made it abundantly clear that it wants to do more, much more, to help solve this great problem. And make no mistake, in important ways, this problem is, to use the title of our colleague, Professor Susan Solomon's terrific new book, solvable. A year or so ago, Sally challenged our community to find new ways to bridge the gap between what we can accomplish as a collection of energetic, talented, ambitious individuals, and the even greater contributions that we're capable of if we act together. And today's event is an important milestone in building that bridge. Sally, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks for the introduction and also for the incredible insight, care, energy you've devoted to bringing the Climate Project to life. I mean, you've just done an incredible lift, and I hugely appreciate it, although you're not done yet. So many people have said to me, no one else here could have marshaled these forces and created this momentum. So thank you. I hope you'll all join me in expressing admiration and gratitude to Richard. So welcome to everyone here today. I've said many times, perhaps the single most important reason that I came to MIT was to help the Institute organize itself for a meaningful difference on climate change. And now, thanks to many of you, here we are, poised for takeoff. So as we get started, I'll offer just a few observations about the Climate Project and then give you a sense of what we're here to do today. The people at MIT have been pioneering climate-related research since I was in high school, and that was a long time ago. So imagine that. People often ask me, how is the Climate Project new? How is it different from what MIT has done in the past, or from what other institutions are doing? And the simple answer is that the Climate Project is not a conventional academic institute, research center, or school. It's different really in three main ways. First, the Climate Project is a whole of MIT mobilization. It's designed to focus the Institute's talents and resources so that we can achieve much more faster in terms of real-world impact from mitigation to adaptation. Second, the Climate Project is mission-driven and solution-focused. From the very start of our new projects, we will be asking about scale-up. Each of the missions has two essential tasks: to identify gaps and bottlenecks that stand in the way of an effective global climate response, and to select, launch, and support projects to address them. The frontier projects that the missions will launch will have clear metrics and milestones, and they'll be actively managed by the mission directors and their review boards. Finally, and crucially, the Climate Project is also outward-looking. Each of the 6 missions will engage with important partners around the world, including companies, impact investors, technology innovators, social entrepreneurs, governments, nonprofits, community organizations, and philanthropists. So really, the works. A whole of MIT mobilization that's mission-driven, solution-focused, and outward-looking. And if you want to make progress faster and at scale, that is the way you do things. In effect, we're shifting from the standard academic model that places modest bets on lots of discrete, individual projects to a model that bets confidently on the power of our collective strength and then concentrates that collective strength on certain very serious and absolutely critical climate problems. Now, I spent a couple of decades in the trenches of fundamental science, so let me just say that I know that knowledge creation is profoundly important, and there will be plenty of room for that in the climate project. But at this stage, in this global crisis, we must have an impact. We've got to go bigger and faster. And as I said in my inaugural remarks, I want us not only to move the needle, but to break the dial. So that's the work we're here to begin today. We're not here to write a new climate action plan. We're not here to talk about education or funding sources or cogeneration. There will be time to talk about these important things in other forums. But today is about these 6 missions and how together we can best drive positive change in the world. Now, before I conclude with some introductions, I want to offer one last observation. I recently had the chance to speak to 600 or so of our incoming undergraduates. It was their first week at MIT, and they were getting an opportunity to engage in the En-ROADS climate simulation with John Sturman and his team, and I saw John, he's here. I have to tell you, on the whole, they were really excited by the chance to manipulate the different climate levers and see which ones make a real difference and which ones do not. Of course, because this is MIT, a whole lot of them also wanted to know how the models were made. But it was their first week here, so they'll get to that. I also sensed that some of our new students were coming to this with a sense, in a way, of sort of preordained defeat. It's already so late. How could we make a difference? And of course, I understand their anxiety and their concern, but I have no doubt at all that together we can make a difference. In fact, I believe that we have a special obligation to the new students and to their entire generation to do everything we can to create a positive change. The most powerful antidote to defeat and despair is collective action. And that is what we're here to do today. I appreciate all of your creativity and perseverance, and thank you all for joining us. Now to the introductions. Today will consist of 3 parts: a keynote address, a panel discussion with our newly minted mission directors, and then 2 rounds of breakout sessions. Leading the panel discussion is our special guest, Somini Sengupta. Somini is the international climate correspondent for the New York Times and author of the book, The End of Karma, Hope and Fury Among India's Young. She's reported from a Himalayan glacier, a Congo River ferry, the streets of Baghdad and Mumbai, and many places in between. I'm sure we'll have a fascinating conversation. But first, we're going to hear a keynote address from Brian Deese, who I've heard several times now, fantastic. He's previously served as director of the National Economic Council in the Biden White House. In that role, he was instrumental in shaping several highly consequential pieces of legislation, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Brian pairs an easy command of technological questions with a rare grasp of contemporary policy, as well as the politics that it takes for such policies to succeed. For little more than a year, he's been part of our community as an MIT Innovation and Climate Impact Scholar, and we are extraordinarily lucky to have the chance to hear from him today. So please join me in welcoming Brian Deese.
Thank you, Sally. That was unnecessarily kind. And I'm incredibly excited to be here. Because just about 15 months ago, I sat down and had a conversation with Richard Lester. And then not so far after that, I sat down and had a conversation with Sally. And they both said, we want to do something totally different. We want to put the opportunity, the solvable problems associated with climate change at the center of MIT's mission. We want to do it different than other organizations. We want to be focused on solutions. We want to hold ourselves accountable to metrics. We want to think big. We want to be practical. We want to bring this all together. And at the time I said, wow, that sounds really ambitious. Good luck. And then they said, well, would you be interested in coming here and helping us, in ways that you could help to craft this? And I thought to myself, well, now I got to take this challenge much more seriously. But it's an incredible thing, and a tribute to both of you, really, that in a short period of time, basically a year and change, although I know the thinking and the work has gone in, for much longer than that, that you go from that kind of inspiration to structure, process, and action. And that's what I think today, more than anything, can represent and will represent. So I'm very excited to be a part of that. I wanted to, just as a way of, rather than, there is no way to keynote this type of activity because there's so much here. So what I wanted to do was just spend a couple of minutes talking through an issue or a set of issues that I hope gets everybody's creative juices flowing and thinking. And my principal message or orientation as you all go into the work of today and going forward is, how do you stay on the front edge of what Richard and Sally were saying around ambition and pragmatism, and connecting and building bridges to solutions that will actually matter in the real world. That's super important because the magnitude of the risks associated with climate change are extraordinary. But it's even more important because these are solvable issues. In fact, the energy transition globally will be the greatest economic opportunity in human history. The capital transformation necessary to actually drive this process will be the largest capital formation event in history. It has the potential to actually lift people out of poverty. It has the potential to drive international cooperation. It has the potential to drive innovation and improve lives if we get this right. Now, the flip side of that is all the risk associated, but the opportunity is enormous. So that's the orientation that I think we should all bring to this collective project. One vignette at the front end of this. When I was at the White House and I was the president's chief economic advisor, I made an explicit decision to say, how do we bring energy and how do we bring climate into the center of our economic policy? And so as a result, we had a lot of people coming into my office, and I would have technologists come into and say, look, the most important thing is we need new innovation on the cutting edge that will just be so path-breaking that it will solve this problem. And then I would have policy people that come in and they would say, we need a carbon tax, and if we don't have a carbon tax, we need some other pricing mechanism, and we need to build a political coalition to get that done. Really, if we don't get that done, we're not going to solve this problem. And then I would have finance people come into my office and say, we just need to scale from billions to trillions. We need new financial mechanisms that will actually bring the capital in place to actually scale. And then I would bring them all together around a table, and they would all argue with each other. And then I decided to stop having those types of meetings. Because the truth of this issue is that this is the classic wicked problem, where if you decide that there is only one solution, then you run into roadblocks and you end up overcome by this sense that this is not solvable. And when it breaks open is when you recognize that you have to bring multiple strands together, but then when you do, you can actually have nonlinear outcomes. You can make progress in very significant ways. And I think that that's right at the bullseye of what Sally and Richard are admonishing all of you to do and what this climate project has the potential to do. So I want to apply that kind of thinking to one issue that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about here at MIT and over the course of the last year, just in hopes that it will spark some thinking. And that issue is, why hasn't the United States launched a historic effort along the lines of the Marshall Plan to actually deploy and extend clean energy technologies in emerging markets around the world? Why have we not done that? The logic to do so is compelling. It's the basic Willie Sutton principle. You know, Willie Sutton, famous bank robber, he said, why do you rob banks? He said, because the money, that's where the money is. Emerging markets is where the bulk of the emissions will be going forward. And if we don't solve that problem, we don't solve the problem. But if we do solve that problem, we have a credible chance. On the other hand, the logic to why the US hasn't done that to date is also compelling. It's straightforward. We have a weary American public that is very skeptical of taking US taxpayer dollars and sending it overseas. We have an increasingly isolationist and protectionist bent in our politics. And we also have a uniquely partisan view in America about climate and climate change and the relative merits of that, all of which leads to a political coalition that is roughly zero to do this thing that seems compelling. So I've thought about this a lot and tried to apply my own logic of not having those meetings where there is only one answer to this solution. And I think the answer, in a sense, is we have to bring together technology, policy, markets, politics, and the answer lies at the nexus of those things. The first thing we need to do as the US is we need to invest in our own innovative capacity to actually lead and innovate on clean energy technologies. And the good news is over the last couple of years, we've put a lot of the groundwork into place where the United States is a late comer to some of these technologies, but is a fast mover in many of these areas. And now, for the first time in a long time, I can credibly stand here and say there is really serious scaled path-breaking innovation happening in the United States across technologies from the more mature storage and solar and wind, but also to the sort of cutting edge areas of efficiency and geothermal, nuclear, carbon capture. The United States is now in the conversation on these issues. That's the good news, and the good news is that that domestic investment is happening at a scale that it actually could move the needle very significantly globally. If you look, for example, just at the cost reductions associated with technology embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act, the emission reduction benefit, if deployed globally, would be 2 to 4 times larger than the emission reduction in the United States. So that's a starting point. But then we have to step back and say, how do we actually credibly deploy that technology globally? The other rule that I had before this was that analogies to the Marshall Plan are at best very tired, because in our policy discourse, a lot of times when people say, I just want to spend more money on X, they say, I should have a Marshall Plan for X. And so I want to acknowledge that, as I'm about to say, we should have a Marshall Plan for clean energy. The reason is because if you go back and you look at the time when Secretary Marshall and President Truman were in place, particularly when Marshall went to China and came back, having failed in a mission to try to bring the Chinese into the fold of democratic nations. Their view was largely born out of the limits of American power in the post-World War II era, but the potential for the United States to be both generous to our allies and pro-American in our approach. And I think that key insight helps to unlock where we are today. Generous to our allies, but pro-American in our approach. In the Marshall Plan context, this was about actually direct purchase commitments of US goods, US capacity, that had been built up as part of the World War II mobilization, delivered to Europe to help them rebuild after the war. If we extend that today, we have the potential to actually take US innovation, US technology, and extend it to emerging markets. But to do that is going to require a complicated intersection of technology, policy, markets, and politics. On technology, we do need to push the frontiers of technological innovation, particularly in hard decarbonized sectors, and particularly in innovations that will reduce the so-called green premium, the additional costs of doing something in a low-carbon way, in emerging markets, in the actual communities, in the actual geographies that we are talking about. There's lots of exciting innovation going on, including here. We were with the MIT Corporation earlier this year, where there was a presentation about efficient air conditioning technology designed particularly to be useful in climates like India. That type of technological innovation we're going to need to push the boundaries of that technological innovation. The second is we need to think differently about policy. We need to have a different orientation than we've had in the past to what is feasible and what is advisable. You take the issue of the resilience of our supply chains. For many years, the focus was on just-in-time supply chains. We should actually have as little resilience and as little redundance in our supply chains as possible. We have learned through the course both of the pandemic, but also the reliance that we have on certain producers for most or all of our goods and inputs that go into clean energy supply chains, that presents risks that could actually slow down the clean energy transition globally. So we need new policy solutions to address that question. We need to think about what it actually looks like to build strategic reserves of critical inputs. We need to think about how we can use critical minerals and other things that are really bottlenecked from a supply chain perspective in more efficient ways. And we've got lots of great thinking going on at MIT on that topic too. But we're going to need to get better and more on the front edge of thinking about what it actually means to have diversified supply chains in this context. And to do that in a way where we are both recognizing the importance of the competition between the US and China and the geostrategic competition between these two countries, but also recognize that our goal from a policy perspective cannot be that any one country is completely delinked from our global supply chains. We've got to find a diversification equilibrium. We're going to need different structure to global markets. To the point about a new equilibrium, we're entering quickly into a world where in the period post the Paris Agreement, where countries are increasingly going to start to try to reflect the carbon content of goods at their borders. Next year, the European Union will launch a carbon border adjustment. The United States needs to have a credible answer to that question. We need to create a new policy apparatus that actually says, what does the market look like when we start to build in the carbon content of goods overseas, and what are the implications of that for emerging markets who don't have the luxury of resources to actually cover the costs associated with those potential levies. So when you bring these things together, the answer is not simple. But when you start to bring these things together, the answer becomes solvable. We need to be, in my view, we as the United States need to be more prepared to be generous with our emerging market partners and allies. We need to be prepared to show up in country with more resources, more commitment to actually problem solve, to think about technological solutions that don't just work in the abstract, but that work in the concrete and on the ground. But as we do so, we need to be prepared to do that in a more generous but also genuinely pro-American way, identifying areas where US innovators, US producers can actually help to partner in those solutions, and that communities across the United States can see that benefit concretely in their lives and in their communities' lives. We need to do that in a way that reflects a new equilibrium in a global trading system, where on the one hand, we cannot accept an outcome where China dominates these markets in a way that creates global imbalances, that is unstable as an equilibrium, but also recognizes that we need to find diversification and a role for not only the great powers, but also more and increased global trade flows in the process. Now, that might all sound hard, and that might all sound complicated, but it allows us to think, okay, what do we need to do to break down those problems? What are the component parts that we could actually bring to bear? What would it look like to have a critical minerals resilience reserve, for example? How would you design it? What would the market structure be? What would the technologies be that go into it? And once you solve that problem, you start to solve and ladder into the broader problem as well. I raise this issue not because I think that this alone is the most important issue or idea to solve, although I think it's an important one, but more to try to help get your creative juices on thinking about how to solve the problems that you all will identify and that you all will work through over the course of the days and weeks and years ahead. And so as I pause and I shift to the work ahead, I would offer just 3 modest suggestions or reflections to think about how you take this work going forward. The first, start and end with very high ambition. As we've talked about, this is a wicked problem where you can easily get knocked down to the idea that it's not possible to actually make progress. And I would argue that part of the way to solve that is to keep the ambition very high. Maybe a historic clean energy Marshall Plan is too audacious. Maybe some people will roll their eyes in that invocation, but maybe not. And maybe we could do it, and maybe it would change the world. The good thing about MIT and our community is that you have done this before. We've got examples where MIT has taken something that seemed completely improbable and made it possible. And I believe that part of what is required of this effort, this collective effort, is to keep that type of audacious thinking at the top of our mind. The second is constantly think about building bridges and connecting. These problems will only get solved, I'm confident will only get solved, if we can bring the technology and the hard science and the policy and the actual urban planning and community planning, the behavioral sciences, the economics and the markets together. And as complicated as that is, I really do think that this climate project is setting itself up to try to keep pushing everybody toward building those bridges. I think that's incredibly exciting, and I would just encourage people to have that in their mind. And then the third piece, and I'm obviously, I am biased on this one, but engage on policy early in the design process, engage in policy early in the ideation process, because it is the case that in almost all circumstances, to solve this problem will require a policy solution. That may be at the local, the federal level, it may be at the international level. But the more you're building that into the design strategies early on, the more opportunity there will be to actually unlock different answers along the way. And I think that I want to just sort of name the importance of putting policy at the center of this whole project is, again, another reason that gives me optimism for what we're going to figure out and solve here. So I want to just end on that note of we rarely take on climate convenings and start and end with optimism. And I want to inject as much of that as possible. There'll be plenty of time for us to get into the specific elements of this wicked problem that we haven't solved. But I'm really excited to see and hear and learn from all of you and what we identify to work on going forward. So thank you. And now I will do my most important task, which is I will bring Somini Sengupta up to the stage to launch the panel discussion.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I just want to start by asking all of you to introduce yourselves to our audience. Just give us your name.
I'm Elsa Olivetti.
Andrew Babbin.
Jesse Kroll.
Miho Mazereeuw.
Gustav Reinhardt.
Chris Knittel.
Benedetto Marelli.
And we're going to save time by leaving it at those introductions, and you can read what they do, you know about their stellar work. And thank you to President Kornbluth and your team for the invitation to do what I love doing, which is asking very accomplished, erudite people, such as yourselves, perhaps kind of ordinary, pedestrian, practical questions that might be on a lot of people's minds. So that's what we're going to spend some time doing today. I've already warned them all that we're going to keep these moving and that we're going to keep this as a conversation. What I'm hearing from the speakers before is that you are telling a story. You're trying to tell a story of our time. That story really starts with possibility, the possibility that MIT can play a real major role in solving this problem as it has before, as it has in the past, that you are committing to work quickly and together. There's an ensemble cast here, bringing different perspectives, bringing very different skills. The thing is, though, that this story is taking place against quite an unusual backdrop. You are starting this mission with 5 years left in this critical decade, which by global scientific consensus is the decade when the world economy really needs to pivot away from burning fossil fuels and at the same time adapt to the hazards that we already face, even here in the richest country in the world. And just to kind of start with a reality check, 2024 is shaping up to be the hottest year on record, perhaps surpassing 2023. And at least in the short term, the world is poised to surpass, at least temporarily, that critical 1.5 degree threshold, temporarily. But that, I think, is important to keep in mind, to say that the stakes are very high for you all. There is real urgency, and that what distinguishes this mission is that you're really setting out to innovate for social good, and for social good at scale is what I'm hearing. I know you're still working out your agenda for your respective projects, but I just want some of you, not all of you, to just kind of weigh in on what you think are the tractable problems that you are setting out to solve. How long do you have? And do you have to break some academic conventions to solve these problems? Any of you, please jump in. You're so polite.
I mean, I can jump in to just say that that is the question, right? How do we position the world for in this time of tumultuous change without further kicking the can down the road? How do we solve something while also trying to beat down the uncertainty of any action that we might take? And so I think those are a lot of the tractable problems that we want to solve, which is identifying where those gaps of knowledge are and filling them rapidly. And that's largely not doable in the conventional way that science is funded in the country, with small-scale, single PI type research projects, but rather this collective mission that goes beyond the sum of any parts.
Somebody else want to jump in on how long do you realistically have, and what are some of the tractable problems?
Well, I'll key off something that Brian mentioned, which is, look, from a policy perspective, we have gridlock in DC most of the time. States are doing a lot of things. So in principle, we have kind of a test bed of potential successes at the state. The global framework might very well be completely broken and needs to be rethought. But those are all opportunities that we could actually make some traction.
Christoph.
Maybe to build on that, Brian, I really loved your presentation, and I really like the notion of being generous. And at MIT, we're really good at creating IP and making a lot of money. We're always so proud about how big the economies are that we are creating. But I think for a lot of parts of the world, we have to kind of let loose of our IP and bring a lot of the analytical and technologies that we have and give them free out to everybody in the world. And hopefully then we'll find people that support us in doing that. That wasn't the worst idea, but I think that together will help policymakers and will help us to evaluate new technologies.
I hear you when you say this is an opportunity, but this sounds really hard given the urgency. Why do you want to do this? Can someone talk about like your personal motivation? What excites you about this and what makes you fearful?
Well, I'm excited about all the faces that I see out in the audience that I know we get to work with and collaborate with. It's really, I think, part of why I've been drawn to join this effort is that there's a tremendous amount of urgency. We all need to do everything we can and roll up our sleeves and get it done. And the extent of the strength that we have in the audience and outside the Institute gives me great confidence that we'll be able to identify these ways we can de-risk some of the technology challenges that Brian talked to in collective ways and try to set an example in these sorts of ways. So I want us to, I really like to sort of be bold, be audacious, be ambitious. I think I'm fearful of us sort of seizing this moment, taking this momentum, but then it's hard, it's tired, we're all busy and going back into our silos and continuing that. So I think finding ways to continue to keep the momentum, keep the energy that we're feeling today is what I hope to get around that fear.
Yes?
Yeah, I'm just probably most excited about the chance of MIT really meeting its potential in this space. We all, there's so much amazing work going on in all these different aspects of the problem, from science to engineering, social science. And but all the PIs, we're all doing our own little sliver of our own little part of the big problem. You put this all together, and there's a huge potential, huge opportunity, I think, to make a big difference. And this climate project was really built with that opportunity in mind.
I know you're still designing your agenda, but as you're designing this, how do you think about scale? And how do you think about impact? Who does it have to impact? How many people does it have to help? Does it have to be financially feasible? Does it have to be politically palatable? What are some of the criteria that you're looking at, and who are you thinking about?
I think we will impact different communities and different parts of the world in a different way, so we're going to end up having different solutions. There's going to be a focus for sure on the big emitters and people who do produce a lot of GHGs, and we're going to try to reduce them. At the same time, we're going to shape new communities that are going to be built, as we're going to add 2 billion people to the world, so we need to think about them and how to build their communities and how to impact their lives, right? And so there's going to be definitely, as we also heard from the keynote speaker, that there's going to be an impact on the developing part of the world and the parts of the world where probably needs the most innovation when it comes to adaptation. And at the same time, there's going to be a big focus on mitigation of current emissions.
Yeah, we were talking at lunch that, it has to be politically feasible, and it has to be in separate nation self-interest, otherwise it's not going to happen, right? And when you think about who the big emitters are going to be as we go forward, those are nations that have lots and lots of issues. They're not developed, they're developing. And if you're a leader in those countries, it has to be in the self-interest of your constituents for you to adopt, whether it's the technology, the policy, or what. So how can we design a system where it's actually in their self-interest to adopt the technologies or the policies that we feel are most impactful?
Miho, you're in charge of the Empowering Frontline Communities project. How do you think about scale and impact?
So this is something we think about a lot, and any kind of really quality engaged projects that we've done with communities have taken years to build trust, and it has been small communities that we've worked with for many years. And so how do you scale that without compromising is really the challenge that I'm faced thinking about this. And I think that's why it really involves our whole community, including everyone here in the room and our students. And maybe it's something like creating an MIT Climate Corps where students are engaged in service outside of the institute. There are many things that we're brainstorming, but really trying to figure out how we can still have quality engagement, work with people, but not ignore scaling and impact.
I mean, you have a big tent here, but do you think about how to bring other people into this tent, especially people who are not conventionally in these conversations?
Absolutely. So as you've heard, this is really the start of these conversations. It's the start of the conversations within the MIT community, but the next stages are then talking to policymakers, talking to community leaders, both nationally and globally. And so there'll be a continuation of this process in the next few months.
One of the things that I find very intriguing is the wildcard project. So Benedetto, I'm going to turn to you and ask, what is a wildcard? How do you know it's wild? And before taming it, how do you even know it's wild?
Well, so first of all, if we define the wildcard, we may not get the wildcards anymore, so we need to have a very, very broad peripheral vision in order to be able to see them and nurture them. The wildcard typically is defined an event that has low probability and very high impact. So for us, it would be a high-risk, high-payoff project, it needs to have the wow moment, right? So we need to see the technology, the innovation, the new policy, and we need to say, wow, this is really has the potential to change the world and to have an impact on the climate. But as I was taught when I was a postdoc, the big problem now is when you go, how you go from the wow to the how. And so the scale up would be the very big issue here. And in order to scale, we will, one of the ideas is also to, first of all, allow a lot of cross-feeding within MIT, so try to bring together different technology to define the Frontiers project, and at the same time to work with local communities in the part of the world that we would like to engage, to be sure that we engage the stakeholders very early stage, and at the same time we'll use local brains to solve the problems, right? Because of course we solve our problems with our technological framework, but as we need to translate it in other countries and in other settings, we need to be able to do so using what they know best probably how to do.
Elsa, wild card?
Well, we're going to leave that to Benedetto, but I think one point I wanted to make that he was talking about in terms of scaling, and then also you mentioned in terms of the tent, is we've talked about the role of policy, we've talked about the role of communities, but I think we also need to think about the role of industry and helping to think about, can we bring the right set of industry players in whatever form, many ways in which industry engages with MIT to try to think about where are their pain points and how can we try to develop the work in ways that is actionable from an industrial perspective too, but with this focus on the emerging markets as we've talked about throughout the day here, and how that will be a different kind of metric and a different kind of way of thinking about implementation. So I think that's another part of the
So not only politically palatable and financially feasible, but doable for existing industries is what.
Well, or doable for a way in which the industry could be involved in the scaling, whether that means existing or pathways to new industry, which I think is part of what you posed in the question of, does it have to be economically feasible? We would want a pathway towards that in maybe transformed business models.
How do you think about what MIT as an institution needs to do to demonstrate what's possible? For instance, there's been debate at all university campuses about the relationship between universities and fossil fuel companies. There's been debates about how to decarbonize universities' buildings, particularly new ones, whether it should get off the gas network and do something else. How do you think about MIT's own demonstration capacity as you embark on this?
I mean, especially our campus, that is absolutely crucial, and we've had for the last half year, 8 months, a pretty cohorted effort where together with facilities, we've been uniquely positioned to work between different parts of the schools and with our facilities to find hopefully these scalable solutions and making our campus net zero. It's really complicated, but part of the attraction for me as taking this mission lead on is how good the experience has been asking my colleagues to chip in a seminar, and I could, without putting too much pressure and guilt on them, everybody said they would be joining us. It's just this, everybody here cares about climate change, especially if they can make a real impact. And our buildings need a lot of love. I mean, this building might be an exception, but we definitely know that we have our work cut out there.
I think there's also a lot of momentum working with the MIT Office of Sustainability. There's this idea of using our campus as a test bed. So we experiment with things on campus that we don't want to just go out into a community and experiment with them, but then having 1 foot on campus and 1 foot in the community, really being able to use the things that we innovate and create and prototype here in both locations.
And there's a reality check there too. We see Julie and Joe in our purview here, but I think one lesson that exercise that Christoph has been really involved in as well is how difficult it is. And if it's that difficult to do here, where we're aligned, where we have resources, that's sort of further motivation, but also acknowledgement of the reality of the unprecedented, change that we need to make, and speaks to the point that Brian made of the real opportunity, the need for the significant capital investment.
You're embarking on this mission on the eve of a very consequential election in the US, and indeed during a year of many elections in many countries. How does this figure into your thinking? Do you expect to influence policymakers, or do your solutions perhaps need to be agnostic of whoever is in power? And I want Miho to reflect on this from the perspective of, what frontline communities need, and Chris, of course, who is heading the policy arm.
So I would say we need to be strategic, but somewhat agnostic because, well, in our recent past, we also had a time where we were not allowed to use certain words in NSF grants and other federal grants, and yet we continued to work and power through it. And these events are not stopping. Like, you can't pretend a hurricane hasn't come through and destroyed a neighborhood. And so we will get to our goals by working on this problem regardless. I'll hand it to you.
So I think researchers in the policy space can be agnostic, but also understand that their environment changes and the quote unquote right answer may very well vary depending on the environment. I'll just, again, this is just data. I'll just give you an example. When President Obama left office, there was a social cost of carbon that was used for every federal regulatory process that was $50 a ton. When President Trump took office, he made one small tweak to how that's calculated, and that went from 50 to 7. Now, under the Biden administration, it's back up to 190. Right? So that's one that shows you that just those data tell you a lot, right? One is we need more resilient policies, right? Can we design a social cost of carbon or a framework that doesn't have these starts and stops? Again, not making value judgments, but just responding to the world. So I think that's a part of the mission. How do we think about not just the policy, but how do we think about the resiliency of the policy? And that's at a national level, and those same issues exist at the state level and certainly the global level, where we haven't got much traction at all, right?
Well, this was, I'm glad you raised that, because we're also living in a time of deep fractures in the international order, and really a time when a lot of people are raising questions about whether some of the old international institutions even work, whether some of the international norms really even work. So does that matter as you embark on this project? The state of the global order? Should we be thinking about global cooperation differently?
I mean, of course it matters, right? I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum in any capacity. But the beautiful part of doing science is that the results inform everyone equally in society globally. And so there's an advantage of us being able to work together in all of our different purviews, where some of us might be able to ignore a little bit the international pressures and the turmoil and just the churning over of governments, whereas others really need to translate that science into these actionable directions. And I think that that's a power of us being able to work together, and not just the 7 of us, but as a whole community.
It underscores the third piece of what President Kornbluth laid out a bit ago, right, is the outward nature of how we want to be taking the project and figuring out how do we be transparent in the systems that we're developing for accountability, how we want to hold ourselves accountable, the role of data and all that. And so I think thinking about that with this outward from MIT, but also international lens, and how different, the idea of how different communities, different countries are going to be interpreting and using data that we think about outwardly is probably underscores the effort that we need to pay in that regard.
Yes.
Well, I was answering that would bias my breakout session, so I don't want to.
Well, no, please, go for it.
No, I think, of course it matters, and of course we have to But I think that's part of at least my mission, is to think about what those new governance structures look like.
Yeah.
And how they can be more effective.
Can you take us a little bit into your thinking about how do you measure, how do you kind of check yourself that this really is innovation for social good? Is it possible to measure that? Is it possible to have certain, metrics for each of the projects or for the mission as a whole? Is it by the number of people that a potential solution can impact? Is it by its adoption as policy by a certain government? Is it just, theoretically this draws down X million, gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere? How do you measure that this is for social good?
I don't think we fully agree yet on that, but I personally think impact would mean that whatever we come up with, people are using and adopting it. And that ideally we can demonstrate an amount of carbon reduction that actually happened due to us. This is a loaded question, it's very difficult to demonstrate that. But if not half the cities in the world are at least aware of what we are doing in 6 years, that's bad. I think there has to be something foundationally new that we are doing that at least is part of the solution of giving cities a way to manage their carbon emissions.
Yeah. In climate conversations, there's always kind of a tension, and I think Brian Deese hinted at this, between those who champion big technological innovations, an electric plane, a certain livestock feed that will stop cows from belching so we can keep flying and we can keep eating as much meat as we do, then we don't have to give up anything. And then, the other side that says, actually, before all of those new technologies that you're dreaming up are ready, there are lots of things that we can do already that require changes in social norms or real disruptions to established industries. How do you think about that? It's really the fundamental tension in all conversations about climate solutions. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that the conversation I've had with many folks in the room that I'm sort of, smiling at this conversation of sort of fundamentally decoupling growth from resource consumption. And it's not only is it a technological fix or behavior change, it's every example we have of efficiencies that we've gained, we use that efficiency as humans to do more. And so there's, it multiplies on itself, coupling the two tensions that you outlined. So I think we have to think about resource constraints and ways of understanding, what does it mean to have quality of life in the context of those resource constraints. It has to be a part of the discussion.
I think there's no silver bullet, and you need both to some extent. So if you take food waste is what my research is about. If you take food waste as an example, depending where you are, the food is wasted at the consumer level or throughout the supply chain, right? So if you want to target the consumer level, you need to educate the consumer of changing their habits so that they waste less food. But instead, you also need new technologies that allow us to decarbonize the way of how food is stored. At the same time, they can improve the quality of the food and their shelf life. So there may be some tensions, but I think typically you can identify ways to make both of them work. And it has to be geographically specific. So in different parts of the world, you need to use different drivers to make the change.
Yeah, I think food waste is actually a perfect example of this tension, because we are, after all, accustomed to walking into a supermarket and having not only perfectly sized and colored tomatoes, we're accustomed to having it at all times, which is fundamentally at odds with the idea of resource constraints. So, I want to poke you a little bit more on this. Will technological innovations really get there? Or are you talking about fundamentally confronting the planetary constraints?
Mm-hmm. I think we are the last generation that has these choices. I think the longer we wait, the more it will all shift towards mitigation, and then we cannot pick between the two anymore. So this is kind of also why it's fun to be in the mission now, because there's actually something to mission about and to decide about.
Yeah.
I think the longer we wait, the less this will be a true option.
I'll give an ironic example because it's about oil, but in the 1970s, we were all convinced we were running out of oil. Right? And if you go back, so we recently wrote a paper, well, it's not so recent now, but where we went back to 1960 and measured how many years of oil do we have available to the world. And effectively, it's always 50.
Okay.
Right? And we're actually writing a paper now, theoretically, to generate why is the answer 50. But it's 50 for oil, it's 50 for natural gas, it's 50 for lots of minerals and so on. So that's an example where we were convinced we were going to be resource constrained, and we're not, right? Because of the work that's done at MIT and other universities and so on, that push out that frontier over time. So really, to me, as the economist, it's about setting up the institutions where that's the equilibrium, where we're not resource constrained, but we're also fixing the climate. And I think we can do it, but it's also possible not to do it. And I think that's what the project is all about.
In one sentence, preferably a short one, could you please, each of you, say, what do you most look forward to learning from your colleagues? What's the one thing?
I'm looking forward to learn a lot about policy making because I don't know much about it, and I think it's very important.
Well, obviously, it's wild cards. But I'm looking forward to learning about all the technologies that we have to change the policy or adopt policies to confront.
It's actually quite surprising how much time we've spent already together, and we are a little bit like a defunct family right now that meets 3 times a week, and it really plays homage to Richard putting these very different people together. So we have very different leadership styles, and learning from the others is super intriguing.
Yeah, it's been great learning from everybody already. I think the other thing is channeling all of you in through each one of these people and then relearning all of that. And so I'm really looking forward to that process this afternoon.
For me, I think it's how all these topics connect. This is a very complex and big question that at least I'm not used to thinking on that level.
For me, it's the creativity that this panel embodies of the MIT community, which MIT has in spades, where we can learn how to think so far out of the box that we have no idea what a box even is.
It's been really interesting intellectually. I think I'm really interested in learning from my colleagues and how do we continue to push the envelope together and working collectively.
My last question, because we have 1 minute and 36 seconds left. This is really hard stuff to work on. It can be very dispiriting sometimes. What gives you delight in this work?
I mean, I'd say the outlook sometimes can be dispiriting, but that's not how I view the work we do. Like, I love my own research. I think most people at MIT feel the same way. And I don't think there's this sort of feeling of despair or lack of enthusiasm. I guess the one thing that I do find dispiriting sometimes is thinking about my own stuff, which I think is the most exciting stuff there is, that is only a tiny little fraction of the big problem and the solutions to the problem. And that's one of the reasons I think this climate project's so exciting, because it's a chance for us to really connect on all that.
So we developed a MIT-based high school curriculum over the last few years, and so over the last couple of years, we've had 120 high school students on campus every year to interact with the curriculum.
Delight.
And if anyone has a reason to be down and upset. It's them, and they're not. It's the interacting with them is so uplifting, and maybe I just want to stay young the rest of my life, but that's what this work is all about, is seeing the passion in their faces and the undergrads' faces. Yeah.
One more, Delight.
I love meeting with people who are in the community who are so strong and doing this and moving the needle bit by bit and thinking that maybe we can help move the needle faster.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
To Somini and to our wonderful mission directors. Also, big thanks to Brian for his outstanding opening remarks. I actually think this was a good demonstration of a lot of what Brian was talking about, which is we have a lot of different perspectives to bring to bear. One difference, though, is when we call these people together for a meeting, it's all going to be synergy. We're not going to splinter. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm grateful to everyone here who's participating in the kickoff. And this marks a key moment and a really important effort. So I'm glad to have all of you with us as we get the climate project off the ground. Now, for those of you who are here in the room, we have a lot of people online as well, but in the room, we're ready to move into breakout sessions. So today, our focus is strictly on the missions. Now, you can expect the Office of the Vice President for Climate to engage our community in other aspects of the climate project in the months ahead. But as we heard in today's panel, missions are MIT-wide problem-solving communities, with each one focused on a broad domain where solutions are required for effective climate response. And you'll recall that I said each mission has 2 tasks, and we heard more about it here, to identify gaps and bottlenecks, and to choose and support projects to address them. And I think, Jesse's comment on incremental things and then putting it all together. The truth is that sometimes it just takes one of those things that breaks open a whole area by really resonating with everybody else who's working on the problem. In my own field, I'm a cancer biologist. When I think about all the fundamental immunobiology, and now we have immunotherapy, there's going to be some individual discoveries that, because we're working collectively, it will break open, I think, whole new areas. So today, our focus on these areas is the first task. Together, we're going to begin to assess national and global progress within each mission's domain, identify critical gaps and bottlenecks that are preventing an effective global climate response, and then share ideas with each other on new paths to overcome them. So let's ask this as well. Where is MIT best positioned to make a difference? I think I'm biased. I think some of the most exciting work in the world is going on here, but I think we really have to think about where our comparative strengths are, our advantages, and how we can leverage those for the best end. Now, this is just the first start, of course. We only have an hour for each breakout, but we can start a conversation and spark some fresh thinking, and we can begin to capture and synthesize the collective wisdom of the people at MIT. That is the longer conversation at the heart of the climate project. The breakouts will be held downstairs on the 6th floor in 2 sessions, one from 3 to 4, one from 4 to 5. And at the end of the first hour, we ask that you please move quickly to your second session. Then at 5, we'll have a reception, and I hope you all have more time to talk. I believe you've already received your breakout room assignments for each session, so I'm going to ask you to head to the designated rooms. I am going to be lurking and kind of listening to your conversations, which I'm looking forward to. So please head to the rooms for the first breakout, and let's get started. And again, thank you so much, Somini, and to our panelists.